Good morning. And on behalf of the Hudson Institute, I would like to welcome all our viewers around the world. I am Husain Haqqani, Senior Fellow and Director of South and Central Asia Program here at the Hudson Institute. Hudson Institute is a research organization promoting American leadership and global engagement for a secure, free, and prosperous future of the world. Pakistan has often been a country in crisis, but over the last few months, it remains mired in a poly-crisis: political, social, economic, and security. General elections are scheduled to be held in end January, extending the term of the caretaker government by 3 months. And even then, there are people who are skeptical about the prospect of a free and fair election. The omnipotent Pakistan security establishment has regained its supremacy with a vengeance and appears to be more in control today than it has been in recent years. Inflation remains at an all-time high, and economic growth has slowed down with contraction in both agricultural output and the industrial sector. A very young population has a very large percentage of unemployment. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is the Pakistani Taliban, continues to undertake terrorist attacks across the country using safe havens across the border in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Afghanistan has proven to be a Pyrrhic victory for Pakistan. Pakistan had supported the Taliban for many years. So what is the future for Pakistan? I have written extensively on the subject, but today I am going to defer to the wisdom of a younger generation of Pakistan-born experts who know much more than many of us about the current mood of the country and have their own ideas about how things might shake out in Pakistan. I'm not going to read the long bios of my guests, but let me introduce them quickly. Amber Rahim Shamsi is Director of the Center for Excellence in Journalism at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. She is an award-winning multimedia journalist with wide-ranging experience in television, radio, online, and in the print media. Asfandiyar Mir is Senior Expert at the United States Institute of Peace here in Washington, D.C. He has written extensively on national security and foreign policy issues with a focus on counterterrorism, South Asia, security affairs, social media, and politics. And Uzair Younus is Director of the Pakistan Initiative at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. He regularly publishes articles on South Asian politics and economic issues for the Prophet magazine and Dawn, and he has been featured on various news outlets, including Bloomberg, CNN, and CNBC. He also has a thriving practice in consulting, primarily about how to connect public goods and profitability in South Asia. So before we deep dive into issues, let us first get a sense of what is happening in Pakistan today. Amber, I will start with you. And the reason for that is that you're on ground. You're in Pakistan's largest city, Karachi. Could you provide our audience with an on-ground assessment of the political lay of the land?
Thank you so much. And I think that you framed it really well. It is a poly-crisis, naturally. And how are people dealing with this poly-crisis? Obviously, I think the biggest sort of top of mind, more than anything else at the moment, is the economic challenge, which is inflation, which is, possibly at a historic high. And I'm sure Uzair would confirm this. But it isn't just that it is at a historic high. It is that it's been consistently high. And people's cost of living has increased. They're finding it difficult to pay for education. And we see that in some of the figures in terms of where people are placing their kids. So the preference is for private schools, even if they're low-cost private schools. A lot of people who can't afford it are either putting their children out of school or putting them into government schools. Electricity bills are very, very high. The other day, the lift operator at my university was talking to somebody, and he was saying, he was talking about how he can't pay the bill because his bill is at least a third to more than half of his income that he earns, and he was thinking of borrowing. So obviously people are either borrowing, cutting down on important costs like education, and petrol is so high that a lot of people are also just talking about how they're sort of reducing commutes, trying to find ways to not go out. And it seems contradictory when you see how people are also still, going out to restaurants and all of that. But we have to remember that's a very small percentage of the population keeps getting talked about. But the important thing, just sort of broadly, how are people surviving and living? That's difficult. I don't know anybody now who doesn't have two jobs, who doesn't have a side gig of some sort or the other. And that sort of is taking its toll on people. And they obviously need somebody to blame. At the moment, they're blaming the last government, the Pakistan Democratic Movement, which is a coalition of several political parties, most notably the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, the JUIF, which is the right-wing party led by Maulana Fazlur Rahman. Part of this coalition was the Pakistan People's Party as well. But I think more so just since the Prime Minister was Shehbaz Sharif from the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, and the Finance Minister was also of the PMLN, a lot of the sort of, I think, responsibility lays on their shoulders, and people are laying it on their shoulder. And because people feel that, the last government is responsible for the more difficult economic challenges that they're facing. You also see concurrently a rise in the popularity of Imran Khan, who is in jail at the moment under various charges, most significantly, obviously, the Cypher conspiracy case, which we'll also talk about. So Imran Khan's popularity has obviously risen since the vote of no confidence last year in April, which ousted him, partly because Imran Khan played up or played into many of people, Pakistani's fears about the foreign interference. Imran Khan tapped into that. America had clearly, according to him, America had interfered and had him removed because of his stance on Russia. He went to Russia the eve of Russia's attack on Ukraine, and various other reasons. He presented obviously that's one reason. And the second reason is partly, I think, just the sort of challenge or the difficulty governing this country, which has escalated over the past few years. So that's sort of what's happening in terms of the economic challenge and how it's impacting the political challenge. At the same time,
any sign of an election?
Yes, that's a sort of big question, isn't it? I think you said that at the beginning. At the moment, elections seem to be happening. And I'll tell you why. There were several things that the military establishment, as well as the medium government, needed to happen before they could go forward with elections. And I think one was the IMF deal, so the standby agreement, which came in, or the economic challenge, for which they've created the Special Investment Council as well, and we can talk about more that later as well. The other thing was the political, which is what to do with Imran Khan. 9th May and the attacks on military installations by Pakistan Tehreek-e-Taliban workers and leaders provided the military a very sort of convenient way of clamping down on the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Taliban and Imran Khan. And we've just seen yesterday, for instance, one key young leader gave an astonishing interview to an anchor person, claiming that he had witnessed Imran Khan masterminding the 9th May attacks, which
basically the repression seems to be working in the sense, not in the sense of human rights, which obviously are being trampled, but in the sense of putting pressure on the political party of Imran Khan, while he and his other top leaders are in prison, and those who are out are having to distance themselves from him.
Absolutely. There is absolutely clear signs of pressure as well. So I think just because, even though the economic challenge hasn't been resolved, the political challenge, as far as I can see, has to some extent been resolved. So even though Imran Khan, according to recent Gallup surveys, and anybody that you talk to, if you go on the ground, people would want to, I apologize, vote for Imran Khan. But at the same time, given that so many of his party leaders have left him, and the few that have remained will find it difficult to sort of cobble together the candidates for various constituencies. So that would obviously happen. Yes.
Uzair, let's turn to you for a moment. There are those who argue that this political crisis is a sideshow, that Pakistan's biggest crisis this time around is economic. And in fact, it's the economic challenge which is aggravating the political crisis too. If the public had less issues to worry about the things that Amber has spoken about, electricity bills, not being the middle class, not being able to send their children to school, the poorer classes totally marginalized, and but I think that they are a bit used to it. They've gone through many phases of not having essentials. A larger percentage of Pakistan's population moving below the poverty line, according to most to recent numbers. What is your take on the economic challenges, Uzair?
Thank you for that question and for having me. I think you're partly right, I would say, on the fact that people in the lower income bracket are used to these crises in Pakistan. So if I look at the data, for example, since the turn of the 21st century, among its peer group of economies that were part of its peer at the turn of the century, perhaps may not be today, for example, India and Vietnam, Pakistan has had the second lowest rate of annual average growth. This is the lowest rate of average annual growth and the second highest average annual rate of inflation. This includes Nigeria, Morocco, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, etc. So in that sense, we know for 23 years, Pakistan has been lagging. That data proves it. But what's different this time around is that over the last 3 to 4 years, Pakistan has had an immensely divergent experience on the inflation front, something Amber was referring to as well. And the data then shows us that, for example, over the last 3 years, the rate of inflation in Pakistan cumulatively has been over 100%, whereas in Bangladesh and India, it's been roughly 25 to 30 odd percent. So a 3 times divergence in the rate of inflation. What that means is that not only has this crisis has now impacted the lower economic rungs of society, which, 1 in 4 children malnourished, etc. Almost half of young women illiterate in Pakistan. So, that already was a problem. But now it's bleeding into the middle and upper middle class, the aspirational classes of Pakistan. So their purchasing power has been fundamentally destroyed, and it will take years to recover from that crisis. So it's different in that sense. Now, did it have to be this way? My answer to that is absolutely not. It didn't have to be this way. It has been a series of faulty economic choices Pakistan's elites have made over the last few years that have exacerbated this crisis. So, for example, in the run-up to the vote of no confidence that Amber was referring to, Imran Khan's party put out a petroleum subsidy that basically not only put a gaping hole in the fiscal deficit, but put the IMF program on track. And the PDM government came in, they were so unsure about what they wanted to do that they actually continued with this subsidy for weeks on end before they went back. But by the summer of 2022, they had a grip on it. The IMF had come back in and the situation was moving forward. But then Mr. Nawaz Sharif, sitting in London, and his family decided that the then finance minister, Dr. Miftah Ismail, was not up to the task. And they sent their relative Ishaq Dar into Pakistan as the finance minister, who promised to bring the value of the dollar down, etc. We all know about it. That change of policy put the IMF program back off track. And it put the economy in this period of uncertainty that continued through early 2023, when the prime minister then finally realized, Shehbaz Sharif, that he had to intervene and deal with the IMF himself because his finance minister was not up to the task. And I think it has been that series of errors in that era that compounded the problems facing the economy, to which then meant that the IMF program was off track, and then Mr. Sharif's interventions led to a new agreement with the IMF. But even at this point in time, when there has been so much talk about a Special Investment Facilitation Council, crackdown on smuggling, closures of the Afghanistan border, Pakistan's policymakers are continuing to think that by overvaluing the rupee, for example, or curbing quote-unquote smuggling and hoarding in the economy, they can solve this problem. Whereas the real problem is the fiscal deficit side issue, and the fact that Pakistan's rich continue to refuse to pay a fair share of taxes, even amidst a historic crisis in the country. And so long as that remains the case, elections or no elections, free and fair elections, or a quasi-hybrid regime or a dictatorship, if the decision matrix does not change, this crisis will continue to worsen. So my view always has been, even if you have elections, a new government without a roadmap or one that follows Kakunomics theories will only exacerbate this crisis moving forward.
So a long-term crisis exacerbated by the mistakes of the last 2 years. That's a summary of what you have said. The populist wave, on the one hand, reflects the resentment of what you call the aspirationalist class of Pakistan. They are probably more pro-Imran Khan than many others and have kept him alive politically. But at the same time, his return to power is not necessarily going to be particularly good for the economy. So hold that thought. We'll come back to this subject of who or what might be better for the Pakistani economy than the other. But overall, your characterization is that it has been a slow-moving train wreck rather than something that has just happened right now. Asfandiyar, the security situation in Pakistan has worsened since the Taliban took over in Afghanistan. Some of us had predicted it, but the Pakistani military had thought that this was the best way to secure Pakistan. They thought that the Taliban will regime in Afghanistan, and once they are there, then Pakistan will be in a better position to deal with India. None of that has panned out as planned. And amid the political and economic crisis, tensions have emerged with the Afghan Taliban. There is an attempt to try and send back or force back a large number of Afghan refugees in Pakistan back to Afghanistan. And of course, there have been the terrorist attacks by the TTP. What do you see as the key issues in the security sector for Pakistan?
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador Haqqani, for, first of all, convening this discussion. Thank you to Hudson, and it's great to be a part of this this panel with Uzair and Amber. Look, I think the premise is absolutely correct. Pakistan supported the Taliban's insurgency and was very excited and happy when the Taliban rose to power in August 2021. But soon after, I think that the Taliban's return to power, it became clear was going to be a big challenge for Pakistan, and that the scale of that challenge has only grown and expanded in the last two years. I think the big challenge right now is the Taliban support for the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. There is a lot of violence in Pakistan's borderlands, along Pakistan's western border, right up from the north in Chitral down to Balochistan, and this violence is becoming more lethal, and it is primarily driven by the TTP's bases and safe havens in Afghanistan, which the Taliban are not only shielding, but I believe that the Taliban are providing a lot of material help to the TTP as well. The big question is, why are the Taliban doing that? I think the conventional wisdom in Pakistan remains that perhaps the Taliban are stuck with the TTP, that this is an entity that supported the Taliban in the insurgency against the United States and the former Afghan Republic. There are ties, familiar, tribal, wartime ties that bind these two organizations, and therefore it is very difficult for the Taliban to get rid of the TTP, to go after it, to restrain it in a meaningful way. That's a possibility. I think the other sort of bigger, more dangerous possibility is that perhaps the Taliban buy into the TTP's political project of obtaining, of implementing a Taliban-like state in parts of Pakistan, if not all of Pakistan, and that the Taliban's policy then in effect they're trying to engineer some kind of a regime change operation, at least in a part of Pakistan. So if that's the case, I think Pakistanis are in a lot of trouble. some of the tactics that they're trying to pressure the Taliban to revisit their calculus. My fear is that that may not work. There's other terrorist violence, by ISIS, for example. It has mounted over the last year or so. As the Taliban have cracked down against ISIS, some of that threat has been displaced into Pakistan. And we're now seeing mass casualty attacks in places like Bastung, in Balochistan, among other regions. Other issues, security issues that I'd really flag to. One is, Pakistan's traditionally hot border with India. And over the last 3 years now, that border has been relatively quiet. There's been a ceasefire along the line of control in the Kashmir region. And that ceasefire appears to be holding up. There is some talk that perhaps the ceasefire is framed, that Pakistan is maybe activating jihadis once again and wants to push them across the border. But by and large, I don't see much of an effort from the Pakistani side to sort of get rid of the ceasefire. I think the Pakistanis are interested in very much preserving the ceasefire, partly because of the pressures they are facing on the western border. The third and sort of the big issue in this era of strategic competition, intensifying strategic competition, is Pakistan's alignment with China. And Western capitals are watching Pakistan's relationship with China very closely, especially given the economic troubles that Pakistan has had, due to which China's influence on Pakistan has mounted considerably. And we see signs of closer alignment. Pakistan now possesses, a lot of Chinese military hardware. At the same time, we see some caution on part of Pakistani leadership, in particular military leadership. They have stayed out of the India-China border dispute for the last few years. And I think there is still an open question as to whether they will permit any kind of Chinese military access basing in Pakistan. So people continue to watch that issue very closely.
Great. Amber, let's come back to you. The picture you painted was of Pakistanis being an unhappy nation right now. The populace is unhappy. And yet you said the establishment seems to have put in place all elements that would ensure that if they hold an election, the results would not be really alarming for them, because otherwise they wouldn't be holding the election. Explain that to us, and especially to an American audience and an international audience. What are you saying here? Usually repression annoys people, and by all accounts, there has been significant repression of PTI supporters. Why would that not result in the manifestation of PTI support at the ballot box, instead of having a result that would be more supportive or at least acceptable to the military establishment?
Right. Imran Khan and the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, obviously, how they came into power was supported by officers within the military establishment, former spy chief, for instance. The 2018 elections were controversial. The parties that did not, make it to the right side of the aisle in parliament, whether it was Pakistan People's Party, PMLN, JUIF, they all cried foul, and for good reason. 2018 was the first time, for instance, that the result management system put into place to make election result management much more transparent. Actually, it fell flat very badly. It crashed. There was a lot of pre-election rigging, particularly against the Pakistan Muslim Nawaz, who were out of favor with the army as well. Many of their leaders were in jail. Nawaz Sharif returned from London at that time just to go back to jail. So the 2018 elections were controversial and rigged in favor of Imran Khan. Once Imran Khan fell out of favor with the military establishment, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, 9th May was a kind of red line, because until 9th May, Imran Khan had been free to speak about the military's role, certain officers whom he had accused of conspiring to assassinate him, because there was an assassination attempt against him late last year, as well as how the military was trying to stop him. And that sort of led up to, you saw a lot of campaigning by Imran Khan openly. They had, the military found it difficult to deal with him, including the PDM government as well. They couldn't find a way to sort of contain Imran Khan. And that's sort of the pressure built. Imran Khan's arrest was going to be imminent. There are several cases against him, some related to corruption, some related to, again, as I said earlier, the Cypher conspiracy. But his arrest seemed to be inevitable, and Imran Khan, being the sort of, as they say, the kind of politician that he is, taking a leaf from his sort of cricket days in which he plays on the front foot, and, he's a fast bowler. He did not relent, he did not let go, and that pressure kind of built and eventually spilled out in the streets. The military establishment, who had been tolerating Imran Khan and who had ostensibly vowed to stay out of politics until 9th May, have now clearly gone back on that vow and gone gung-ho. And you can see that in its manifestations in many ways. I spoke about how after the 9th of May, several Pakistan Tehreek-e-Taliban leaders who joined Pakistan Tehreek-e-Taliban partly because of the good relationship that he enjoyed with the military, all followed a very similar kind of script. They would hold a press conference. They would announce that they're either quitting politics or joining another party or leaving Imran Khan. They would say they would condemn the rioting on 9th May.
Basically, he's been left alone. He's been left alone.
He is. There's the ones, the PTI leaders who are with him are still on the run. Many of his sort of core committee or core people have left him or have really sort of taken back. And he's in jail at the moment.
So the fact of him being in jail, the fact of his party having been sort of, broken away or critically decapitated, you believe that might be the reason why the outcome of the elections will be not something that will be very shocking for the Pakistani military establishment.
I do think that there's a delay in terms of when those elections will be announced, and I don't want to go into details, but just the elections should have been held in October or November, now in January. Right. And given how
we are looking forward.
Yeah.
So looking forward, all of those factors, which are, of course, not necessarily in accordance with the Constitution, not necessarily very ethical, you believe that they have worked to the advantage of the military establishment.
Yes, absolutely. And it isn't organic. Okay. It isn't something that just happened.
Okay. Now, Uzair and Asfandiyar, both of you can take this question and we can get into it. The politics is not going to get straightened out. I mean, even if an election is held, Amber rightly pointed out that the 2018 election was controversial because people cried foul and said Imran Khan had been unfairly helped and the other political parties had been unfairly undermined. Won't the reverse of that happen this time? And so the similar kind of environment will remain. So the legitimacy of the new order will still be questioned, there will still be a dispute, and there will still be a crisis. And if that is the case, how do you mend the economy, Uzair, without mending the politics?
I think that's the multi-billion-dollar question for Pakistan at this point, given that it needs about...
Well, I don't expect you to write that check, so
yeah. So let me get into sort of the problem here in terms of the strategy that's playing out politically, right? As I said, the first order question is, are there elites on either side of the spectrum, whether they are technocrats, whether they are aligned with the PDM/PMLN or the PTI? Are there people in the sort of core inner circle of influence that have abandoned Kakunomics theories, as I refer to them? And the answer to that is no. The second challenge, of course, is going to be that to do the types of structural reforms Pakistan needs, there is a significant need to have a legitimate government that can convince the people of the country that unfortunately, more pain is around the corner and you need to absorb more pain. So if you continue down this path of repressive politics or a repressive society, how do you convince a country whose median age is 23 years old, where 80 million people are on TikTok, and many of them are jobless, as you put in the introduction, with youth unemployment through the rise? And forget youth, it's across the board at this point in time. And I think the final challenge here will be that even after elections, if you are basically in a situation where the military establishment is firmly in control, you will have an army chief that is going into his second year, and by the end of 2024, looking at possibly another extension. And that dogfight begins within the institution. It will take attention away. So all of the guarantees that the chief has made to people domestically and internationally to realize some inflow of money, which we don't know when and if that is even coming, which we can debate as well, will he remain focused on whatever the reform trajectory is? And the answer to that, of course, if we look at history, is no, because politics and the whole dynamics of that political fight will consume the military establishment by the end of 2024.
And they will have to dole out goodies to be able to please various constituencies, and that basically militates against any economic discipline of the kind that you earlier said Pakistan needs.
Absolutely. And I think that's the final point here, because even if you then in that environment have credible and capable people in positions of power, for example, you have somebody more competent than the current governor of the state bank, will the state bank, which is technically on paper independent, push forward positive real interest rates in an environment where the army chief needs a buy-in from elite segments of society who hate positive real interest rates, for example, right? So I think that tension will continue through 2024, and there will be no easy answers to solving at least the economic part of the poly crisis facing Pakistan.
Asfandiyar, political, economic, and then obviously the security dimensions are all interconnected.
Right. I think they are, and the big concern remains the convergence of, for me at least, the convergence of the security and the economic crisis. Last time around, Pakistan had such a big security crisis. Much of the international community was on the side of Pakistan. The U.S. government was helping Pakistan in a big way. There was a lot of security assistance, civilian assistance flowing to Pakistan, and and that helped. There were political issues at the time. I'm talking about the era in which you were Pakistan's ambassador in Washington, and I think despite political challenges and political bickering and so on and so forth, the security crisis was managed with, say, some international help and assistance, and the then military leadership was able to.
Both security and economic assistance were flowing.
Both security and economic assistance was available at the time. This time around, Pakistan does not have that kind of help available from the international community. Certainly not from the U.S. government. We're yet to see how the Chinese might step up. They are, refinancing and rolling over loans, but that ultimately is insufficient. And I think that increases the stakes of the political crisis we are seeing in the country. That being said, I suspect the military leadership will try to manage the security crisis by working around the political crisis, and we see that in the current policy approach toward Afghanistan, the Taliban. Just by way of example, a week after Imran Khan lost power back in 2022, the Pakistanis carried out airstrikes across the border into Afghanistan. So big decisions of war and peace in Pakistan have been made independent of whatever the political state of play is, and by the military leadership, and I suspect that will continue to be the case. But ultimately, whatever equilibrium Pakistan finds, if Pakistani leaders are able to make security gains, those will be fleeting and unsustainable. And given the lack of political legitimacy and cover for some of the security strategies that we're likely to see in the coming months and years, I fear that we might be back to square one, even if some of those strategies work out.
So 3 young people, all of you painting a relatively gloomy picture. Any silver lining to any of the clouds? Any one of you can go first. Uzair?
Well, since you put me on the spot, and I think Amber was about to say something as well.
Yeah,
Look,
thank God I didn't have to go first.
Well, I'll take the bait.
I saw you unmute yourself, so I assumed that he has something to say. That's why he's unmuting himself. Amber, take 2 more minutes to think.
I'll say what I've said, I think, before and written about before as well. The fact of the matter is that the economic challenges Pakistan faces are not that complicated. They are not rocket science problems that need to be resolved through some creative mix of economic engineering. It requires basic, prudent macroeconomic policies with a credible roadmap that is executed and led by credible people at the top who convince not only domestic constituents, but more importantly, international creditors that A, there is a plan, and B, we're going to stick to the plan. And I think
that has not happened for years. I mean,
exactly.
The first time similar words were uttered was by Dr. Mahbubul Haq, the famous Pakistani economist, the late Dr. Mahbubul Haq, way back in the late 1970s. I remember reading him say similar things, macroeconomic fundamentals, None of that happened. So obviously there is something within the body politic, within the social structure that doesn't let it happen. So where should we take hope that it will happen, could happen this time?
And that's the challenge, right? You're absolutely on point, because if you were to look at economic literature and describe Pakistan today, Pakistan is not a capitalist or a socialist or a communist society. It's a kleptocracy, meaning that the country's resources have been captured by a very narrow segment of elites in the country. The UNDP puts a number to this. It's $17.5 billion a year that is doled out to military inc., feudal landlords, large business corporations. Those are the 3 big chunks that the UN says are sort of part of this elite capture. And just to put things in perspective, 17.5 billion with a B. Just to put that number in perspective for the global audience here, the 2022 catastrophic floods in Pakistan, the loss and damages and the rebuilding cost, all combined of those floods, is $30-something billion, meaning that dole-outs worth less than 2 years of money to the elite in Pakistan would repair all of the damages and then some more to the people of Pakistan, some 33 million people who were affected by this. The challenge always has been political, which is the beneficiaries of the status quo of this elite captured kleptocracy, as I describe it, are the same ones we time and time again expect to reform the status quo. And that goes back to your point of how long we've been saying this, is the fact that the very top people would be the first losers if true and meaningful reform ever happened in Pakistan. And that's why this cycle continues to go on. The only change this time, in my view, perhaps, is, as Asfand was also alluding to, is that the type of economic and security assistance Pakistan has received from 1947 onwards, through the war and terror, and then CPEC being the last handout, that's not there right now. So maybe, just maybe, that might convince the elites in Pakistan that that handout is not coming.
The cushion is gone. The cushion that was provided by external assistance is gone. So you see that as a silver lining on this cloud.
Absolutely.
Okay, Amber, silver lining.
All right, I actually managed to pluck out 2. I think we have an independent Chief Justice heading the Supreme Court at the moment, who's spoken very openly against military coups and interference, who I will say has a good idea of how to reform the Supreme Court, we've seen the politicization of the Supreme Court as well over the last few years. And I think that's good news all round. There's several important cases before him. Let's see how those play out. And I think the second thing is that, I do think elections at the moment are more likely than not. And if they do happen, then we do have political parties that have been worn down and have conceded far too much. But also cognizant of the fact that unless they, as soon as the sort of competition of elections is over. There is a recognition that there needs to be some minimum understanding, or in terms of whether it's the economy or in terms of politics or human rights. And it is a long process. I think the third thing would be that civil society in Pakistan, as broken as it's been, and journalists in Pakistan who faced a lot of repression over the last few years, do continue to push back against the loss of their rights and human rights as well.
So basically, going back to democratic theory, democracy functions best if there is an elite consensus, if I'm not mistaken, and you think that there may be an opportunity for a new consensus, which involves the judges, which involves the political parties who have all made mistakes, which involves the military as well. Something that in a recent article, and let me plug that, it's available on the Hudson website for those who would like to read it. It was titled "A Grand Bargain, Anyone?" And basically the idea was exactly the same. Can Pakistan have a grand bargain in which the judiciary decides to decide cases on the basis of law rather than political expediency? The military makes sure that it limits its role in the country's affairs to the areas that it knows best, which is national security, and the political parties figure out how to work together under well-defined rules of the game. Asfandiyar, you're the third one and the last one to tell us if there is a silver lining to Pakistan's persistent crisis.
I think the silver lining right now is that there is a real sense of crisis, and the Pakistani leadership and Pakistani elites feel that. I cannot say the same about some of the previous rounds of the poly crises in which the elites were insulated. The leadership felt that they had an out, that they were too big to fail, that a Western country or maybe some other country would bail them out. I think there is a growing recognition, in particular because of how these crises have played out over the last year, that there's no help coming, and that ultimately Pakistanis have to solve their own problems. So I think that gives me some hope. However, as Uzair and Amber have outlined, some of the approaches that are being considered and employed are their prospects don't look great, but the sense of crisis is real. And then in my domain, really quickly, I hope this sense of crisis will lead to a reevaluation of Pakistan's foreign policy choices, in particular with respect to India, and on the question of the U.S.-China balance. I think with India, we've seen the Pakistani state and multiple governments dig in on positions that are not all that constructive. There is some obstinance on the side of Indians as well in 2023, but certainly there is a lot of baggage there in that relationship. But I think given this current moment of crisis, the Pakistanis will do themselves big service by looking at that relationship of some of the things they've done in the past and trying to chart a future that is better for Pakistanis first and foremost. And then with respect to the US-China balance, I think Pakistan swung a little too much in the other direction. But as strategic competition is intensifying and these crises play out in that backdrop, I hope Pakistani leaders, recognize that there is a cost to alignment of military alignment, other forms of alliances and alignments that they should be very careful about and calibrate the balance between the United States and China accordingly.
Just
well,
a
thank you very
point
much.
On the China one, just for the international audience who may not be aware, 30% of Pakistan's external debt currently is owed to China. And Sri Lanka, which is going through a major crisis, which went into default, only 10% of its external debt was owed to China. So to echo what Asfandiyar was saying about the strategic competition, the backdrop is significant and the amount of money owed to the Chinese is far more significant than what the Sri Lankans even had in the bank. So, just for context.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Amber Shamsi, Uzair Younus, and Asfandiyar Mir, for explaining to our audience why Pakistan is in the midst of a crisis once again, and how it might actually be a good thing that the rest of the world is not rushing to rescue Pakistan from this particular crisis, because that is forcing Pakistan's elites to rethink their strategies and their attitudes in the economic, political, and security domains. It reminds me of the great Urdu poet Ghalib, who said, "Dard ka had se guzarna hai dawa ho jana," which means when the pain reaches its height, that is the time when everyone searches for a cure. Thank you all for joining us.